Good morning, my name is Harrison Paxton, and the title of my presentation is Many Metamorphoses. Today I'll be doing an analytical investigation of Franz Kafka's novel, The Metamorphosis, and I will be talking about the transformations and metamorphoses that occurred to all the characters. The thesis of my presentation is that the title of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis is not only portrayed and embodied through the metamorphosis of the protagonist Gregor, but also through the transformations of the other characters of the novel, namely Gregor's family members. So when most people think of the metamorphosis, they automatically think of the transformation of Gregor turning into an insect. And while that is a big point in the novel, it's not all about that. And I think a lot of that is shown in the fact that that transformation didn't really even occur in the novel. So all the other characters also had transformations, and that's what I'll be talking about. So the topics of focus, I'll be talking about the transformations, and to do that, I will provide background information on Kafka and his book, The Metamorphosis. I'll be defining the term metamorphosis, and then I'll be analyzing the transformations by giving you a visual chart of differences from the beginning and into the book, as well as supporting textual evidence from the novel. So who is Franz Kafka? Franz Kafka is the author of The Metamorphosis. He was born July 3rd, 1883 in Prague. He was the oldest of 6 children. He had 3 younger siblings. They were all girls. And he had 2 older brothers, but they both died before he reached the age 7. He died on June 3rd, 1924 as a result of his progressively worsening tuberculosis. Many people think he could have starved to death because his sickness it hurt his throat, and it got to the point where he couldn't comfortably eat, so a lot of people think he may have starved. And he's also known for other books such as The Trial and The Castle. The interesting thing about those is that they were published after his death. He asked his friend Max Brod to burn all his writings after his death, but he published them, and we got books like those. So what is The Metamorphosis? The Metamorphosis is one of Franz Kafka's better-known books. It was published in 1915, before his death. It was one of the few books that he actually did publish on his own. The original title was Die Verwandlung. It's a German translation of The Metamorphosis. It can also be translated into The Transformation. And a big topic within it is magical realism, although some people would argue that the events in it may just be like a metaphor for Gregor being sick or crazy or something, but originally it was intended as a magical realism book. So what is a metamorphosis? I chose to do more than one definition because I felt that all these could characterize the changes within the book, and I felt that not all the changes within the book could be categorized in the same way. So the definitions that I chose to use were a change of physical form, structure, or substance, especially by supernatural means, a striking alteration in appearance, character, or circumstances, and a typically marked and more or less abrupt developmental change in the form or structure of an animal. So within the novel, I can see how all of these definitions can be connected. So first off, I'll talk about Gregor's metamorphoses. Gregor was the main character of the novel. In the very beginning, he was transformed into a bug. The first line of the novel, which I'll be going over later, explains this. So he went through the physical transformation into a vermin, as well as the slow deterioration of his health as the novel goes on. He also went through an emotional transformation. He started out having a positive outlook and not really worrying about his new condition. But ultimately, with the behavior of his family and the way they began treating him, he just couldn't really take it anymore, and eventually he just died. And then another interesting point about Gregor is that in the beginning of the book, or prior to the events of the book, he was the family member that did all the work, got all the money, and took care of his family, and he ultimately tried to lift the burden off of everyone else's shoulders. But then, in this book, he becomes their burden, and he becomes what they have to take care of. So here's a visual chart of differences from the beginning to the end. So in the beginning, he's transformed into a vermin, and he's okay with it. I mean, he doesn't really know why it happened or what happened, so he's okay with it. But then at the end, his health deteriorates and he dies. Also in the beginning, he's hopeful. He's hopeful that maybe things will go back to how they were, and he never really thinks about it as a permanent thing. He doesn't ever say, this is how I'm going to be for the rest of my life. There are instances that I'll talk about later from the text where he even says maybe things can go back to how they were. But then in the end, as I said, he gets depressed. When it starts out, he is a traveling salesman, but by the end of it, he obviously can't work anymore because of his new condition. And that a lot has to do with the burden that he puts on the family. And And yeah, he supported the family with that job, but then at the end, when he didn't have the job, he burdened the family. So I find that a little ironic that he tried to lift the family's burden, but then ultimately became the family's burden. So some textual evidence for Gregor is, the first part is the first line of the book. And the part that I found interesting about that was that he was transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. That's probably the most direct reference to a transformation or metamorphosis that occurred throughout the novel. And then from there on out, we just kind of see like his demise. He's slowly getting worse. In part two, he kind of just lived an everyday life. Greta fed him, everything was okay, but nothing was great. Nothing was bad though. And then in part three, it kind of starts to go downhill. It says, Gregor hardly slept at all, night or day. Sometimes he would think of taking over the family's affairs just like before. So he still had hope at that point, but he wasn't sleeping as much, so things were getting worse. And then later on, a couple paragraphs later, he entirely stopped eating. So we know things are getting bad, it's affecting his health. And then later on, and when it gets closer to the end of the novel, he's covered in dust, he's dirty, and he's too lazy to even clean himself. So right there we see that he can't even take care of himself anymore, and things aren't going well. And the interesting thing about that one is that he says like he had used to. So he's still thinking about how things used to be, and he wishes things could go back to that. But at this point, like it says there, he's too indifferent. He doesn't really care anymore. So this is the last appearance of Gregor in the novel, and I won't read the whole thing, but the points that stuck out to me was it said he could no longer move at all. So this is more his health diminishing. He felt relatively comfortable because he tried to keep a positive view of the thing the whole time. But his entire body was aching, he was in pain. But even through all this, he was still thinking of his family with emotion and love. And he felt that, at this point, he felt that he could go away because he realized he was causing a burden. And he says, if it was possible, he felt that he must go away even more strongly than his sister. And then at the end of this, the last breath flowed from his nostrils and he died. So now Greta's metamorphoses. Greta went through a physical and emotional transformation as well. Her physical transformation was from a young girl to a responsible young woman, and her emotional transformation was in her behavior towards Gregor and her actions towards Gregor. When it starts out, she's a young girl, she's caring for Gregor, she has a passion for violin, and she's kind of just happy with life. She doesn't really follow her dreams, but she wants to, she has a dream. And then towards the end though, she's transformed into a young woman, and she gets more and more impatient with Gregor, and she kind of just loses it with him. And she also gets a job as a sales girl to help, which kind of knocks her off her path to her dream. But then at the end, there's hope for her. So textual evidence for Greta. I did it in chronological order, because I felt like for her there was also like a path of her moving towards the way it was in the end. At first, when Gregor first transformed, she wanted to take care of him. She wanted to take on the role of his mother. And it says she was Gregor's spokesperson to his parents about the things that concerned him. And it's not without reason. So she felt that she had to take on the role mostly because like the mother couldn't look at him without freaking out. And it also shows that she's kind of moving towards becoming a young woman now, because it says the unexpected confidence she had recently acquired. But she's still a girl at this point. She's still young. And it says girls of that age, though, do become enthusiastic about things and feel that they must get their way whenever they can. So it's acknowledging that she is becoming more mature, but at this point she's still a young woman, a young girl. So later on, this is in part 3 now. This is when she finally loses it. She's been taking care of him, but now she finally loses it. And she says, I don't want to call this monster. She says, I don't want to call this monster my brother. All I can say is this. We have to try and get rid of it. So she wants to get rid of it now. Even though she's been caring for it and doing all she can, it's her brother, and she can't handle it anymore. And later on down here it says, I can't endure it anymore. And she even says that it'll be the death of both of you. So even though it's her brother, she doesn't care, she's done. And this shows that she's transformed, she has her own independent ideas, and she doesn't really care anymore. And then this is at the very end. This is from the last paragraph of the novel. This shows her final transformation from a young girl into a young woman. Her parents realized that their daughter had blossomed into a well-built and beautiful young lady, and this is where I find that her transformation is complete. At this point, they're now looking to her future. They don't have to look back on the past, and they're looking ahead to her future. So they're going to find a good man for her, and then when they arrived at their destination off the tram, they Greta was the first to get up and stretch out her young body. So this is like a new beginning for them. The family can have a new hope. So now I'll talk about Mr. Samsa. Mr. Samsa, at the beginning of the novel, he's kind of like a helpless, almost lazy father. He's not really hardworking, and he ultimately piled up debt for Gregor to have to work off. He also goes from an emotional transformation, but he's pretty steady the whole time. He's aggressive towards Gregor most of the time. So in the beginning, he's helpless, he's hopeless. He just sits in bed all day, and when Gregor gets home, he sees him, and he doesn't even really make an attempt to acknowledge him. He's always been aggressive towards Gregor, pretty much. In the very beginning, we see him a little bit defensive, talking to the chief clerk, but mostly he's aggressive with him from the beginning. And he's more concerned with the finances than Gregor. Even when Gregor has been transformed, Mr. Samsa is still talking to the rest of his family members about the finances and the debt they have to fix. And then at the end, we see he transformed back into the head of the household. He has a positive outlook, especially with Greta. But he's still aggressive towards Gregor up until his death. So textual evidence for that is when the chief clerk was there, and Gregor's father seized his stick and a newspaper and swatted at Gregor until he could get him back in his room. And then later on was when he bombarded him with apples. And there isn't really much of a change here. We see him get a little bit more harsh with his actions towards Gregor. And this is where Gregor notices a change with his father, from being the lazy man to the head of the household and taking more authority. He says he had really not imagined his father the way he stood there now. And he couldn't imagine that this had been the same tired man that he had always come home to see in his bed laying down doing nothing. And this was who was hardly able to stand up. And now he's standing there standing up straight, dressed in a uniform. And he has a sense of authority to him now. His piercing dark eyes looked out fresh and alert, and his normally unkempt white hair was combed down painfully close to his scalp. So now he looks more professional and has a sense of authority to him. So Miss Samsa's metamorphoses. She is fairly constant in her behavior throughout. We knew like the least about her, but she had an unconditional love for her son, even when he was in the form of a bug. And although she couldn't really bear to see him, she still loved him and she wanted to see him, but when she did, it didn't really go so well. She was like, in my opinion, she was kind of like a foil of Mr. Samsa. Like, to his aggressiveness, she was the sympathetic one, and they kind of evened each other out. And then she attempted to get used to Gregor's condition, but never could. Like, she worked her way up to going in to see him, and then when she did, though, things didn't really go so well. So, at first, his mother wanted to go in and visit, but Greta and Mr. Samsa talked her out of it. And then later on, she did finally go in. They were trying to hide Gregor, but when he came out, she saw him, and she passed out onto the couch. And then later on, we see that she still has an unconditional love for Gregor, even though she can't bear the sight of him. When the father is throwing apples, she ran to his father, her skirts unfastened and sliding one after the other to the ground. Stumbling over the skirt, she pushed herself to his father, her arms around him, uniting herself with him totally. And the reason I bolded that part is because I feel like that kind of like, to me, the parents are kind of one. They even each other out, and that stood out to me. And then her hands behind his father's head, begging him to spare Gregor's life. So she still loved her son and wanted to protect him, even though she couldn't bear him. So now the family as a whole. The family as a whole also went through a metamorphosis. In the beginning, they're kind of like I said, they're putting all their burdens on Gregor, and Gregor has to do everything. But then when Gregor becomes their burden, they kind of wake up and see things how they are and start to do their own work and do things for themselves. So each family member changed their behavior because of Gregor's transformation also, as we saw. So in the beginning, the family was jobless, in debt, relying on Gregor, dependent. They had the charwoman, they had cleaners, they had people that they were renting out their house to, and they were kind of hopeless for their future. But at the end, they realized everyone had a job. They didn't have to worry about Gregor anymore. He was out of their lives, and they were independent now, and they were hopeful for the future, especially with Greta. So this is when they went out at the end of the book. This is something they had not done for months. They went outside and they discussed their prospects and found that on closer examination, they were not all that bad. All three of them had jobs which were very good and held particularly good promise for the future. So right now, everything's looking good for them. So my conclusion is that even though the primary transformation of the novel is Gregor's, that all the other characters also went through transformations, and they play big roles in the books too. This is supported by the ending of the book where they're not even looking back on Gregor, and also by the beginning when Gregor's transformation is the first thing that's mentioned, but the fact that it doesn't happen in the book is also a big thing. So And those are my sources. And that's the end.
Thank you.